Welcome and thank you for finding your way here. This is a quiet space, one made for soft voices and overlooked stories. So much of history has been told by men, about men. But here, I offer something different. Stories of women, narrated by a woman, told slowly, gently, to help you drift to sleep. Research shows many people fall asleep more easily to a soothing female voice. Perhaps because it echoes early comfort. My hope is to bring you long, factual stories centered on women's history, nature, and the deeply feminine. Not just to inform, but to settle your mind. I'll be posting regularly. Most videos will be around 2 hours, long enough to ease you into rest. Whether you sleep through every word or stay with me until the end. If you'd like to join me on this quiet journey, I'd love to have you subscribe and share the topics you'd most like me to explore. So, turn on your fan, settle into your favorite bedding, and close your eyes. Let us begin with the evolution of the word crone. Word crone has not always been kind. It has evolved through several permutations. In modern language, it carries the sting of dismissal, a term spat rather than spoken, usually reserved for a woman deemed too old to matter, too wrinkled to be beautiful, too opinionated to be ignored. A crone is often imagined as hunched, shriveled, sour-faced. She is a joke, a cautionary tale, a body without value. Don't become a crone. She's just some bitter old crone. The insult slices deeper than age. It is about power, independence, refusal. When a woman no longer serves the roles society deems acceptable, youth, beauty, fertility, subservience, she becomes threatening. And the word crone becomes the weapon to cut her down. It is no accident that we do not fear old men in quite the same way. An aging man becomes distinguished, seasoned, wise. But an aging woman is often seen as grotesque, excessive, a sign of what we all must become, yet refuse to face. So the word crone has been buried under layers of fear and loathing. It has been twisted by fairy tales, weaponized in folklore, and used to mock those who age unapologetically. But the story does not end there, because words change, and sometimes they are reclaimed. They are dusted off and lifted from the floor, shaped by new hands, given new purpose. This is the evolution of crone, not as insult, but as insight, not as threat, but as threshold. Let's begin with where the crone once lived. In firelight and folk tales, in roots and runes, in wisdom that waited patiently for the right time to speak. Before she was banished to fairy tales and Halloween costumes, the crone was a figure of profound reverence, a symbol of inner knowledge, sacred timing, and untamed feminine power. In many ancient traditions, she appeared as part of a triple goddess, maiden, mother, and crone, three faces of one divine cycle. The maiden, fresh with new beginnings, the mother, full of creation, and the crone, the elder, the guide, the keeper of endings. Not a footnote, but a culmination. The crone was the one who had seen. She had bled and birthed and buried. She had lived beyond the need for permission. In pre-Christian Europe, goddesses who embodied the crone archetype were not evil. They were elemental. The Celts revered figures like the Cailleach, a winter hag and powerful goddess of weather, death, and rebirth. She ruled the cold months. She shaped the land. Her staff could freeze rivers and shatter mountains. And yet, she was not feared for her wickedness, but honored for her role in the great balance of the seasons. She reminded people that decay was necessary for renewal. The Greeks gave us Hecate, the goddess of magic, ghosts, and crossroads. Often depicted with torches or keys, Hecate was a guide between worlds. She did not shy from darkness. She escorted you into it and through it. She represents the crone, not as a frail figure, but as a guardian of thresholds, life and death, seen and unseen, known and unknown. In Slavic mythology, Baba Yaga remains one of the most complex crones of all. She lives in a house that walks on chicken legs. She rides in a mortar and steers with a pestle. She is wild, unpredictable, terrifying, but she holds wisdom. She asks riddles. She tests character. And for those who survive her forest, she offers answers no one else can give. She is danger, yes, but danger with depth. These were not women to be tamed or tidied. They were not sanitized or made palatable. They were real in the oldest sense of the word, raw, symbolic, larger than life. What they shared was not just age, but autonomy. They answered to no one. They lived on the edges of society, in caves, in forests, in liminal spaces. And that liminality was sacred. They were the ones you sought out when all other wisdom failed. The ones who sat with the dying, who knew the names of herbs and the rhythms of moon cycles. They understood life in its full arc, not just the flowering, but the withering, and how both were part of the same truth. The crone in these early stories was not evil. She was initiatory. You passed through her to reach something deeper. She was the question you had to answer, the fear you had to face, the humility you had to learn. And in many cultures, women like this existed not just in myth, but in the everyday. In matriarchal or egalitarian tribal societies, postmenopausal women often held unique positions of power. Free from the demands of childbearing, they became decision makers, spiritual leaders, mediators, and memory keepers. Their knowledge was considered irreplaceable. Their years, their scars, their silence, all lent them weight. They were not retired. They had only just begun a new, more visible form of work. In traditional medicine systems, from China to Africa to the Americas, older women were the carriers of plant knowledge, ritual practice, and ancestral memory. They were the original libraries. But as patriarchal structures took hold, these women became inconvenient. They could not be married off. They could not be impregnated. They could not be easily controlled. So they were rebranded, not as wise, but as weird, as dangerous, as unnatural. And so the crone, once respected, became distorted. She was cast out, not only from villages and stories, but from consciousness. What was once sacred became suspect, and what was once a guide became a ghost, because words change, and sometimes they are reclaimed. They are dusted off and lifted from the floor, shaped by new hands, given new purpose. This is the evolution of Crone, not as insult, but as insight, not as threat, but as threshold. Let's begin with where the crone once lived, in firelight and folktales, in roots and runes, in wisdom that waited patiently for the right time to speak. The line between crone and witch is a thin one, and somewhere in the tangle of centuries it collapsed entirely. The crone, once a figure of reverence, became the witch. The woman alone in the woods, the one with strange knowledge, the one whose independence was no longer mystical but threatening. As Christian Europe tightened its grip, especially from the 13th century onward, what had once been spiritual or symbolic became heretical and punishable by death. The shift was subtle at first. Pagan symbols were reinterpreted, goddesses were recast as demons, midwives became suspect, herbalists became poisoners, and older women, especially those without husbands or protectors, became targets. The traits that once gave the crone power, solitude, wisdom, age, resilience, were now reasons for suspicion. By the height of the European witch hunts in the 16th and 17th centuries, tens of thousands of women were accused of witchcraft. Most were over the age of 50. Many were widows, most were poor, and nearly all of them were inconvenient to someone: a neighbor, a priest, a landlord, a town council. What united them was not any real crime, but their resistance to easy control. The Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches, published in 1487 by Heinrich Kramer, became one of the most influential and chilling manuals of persecution. It described how to identify, interrogate, and execute witches. And though it claimed to be spiritual in purpose, it reads now like a targeted political strategy, especially against women who were old, outspoken, or unmarried. The witch hunt was not just a religious panic, it was also a tool, a way to remove women from power, a way to silence voices that had survived long enough to become inconvenient, and a way to terrify others into compliance. And underneath it all was the crone, buried under layers of soot and suspicion, but still visible in every gnarled finger and whispered accusation. She became grotesque in popular imagination. Artists and pamphlets depicted witches with hooked noses, wild gray hair, clawed hands, and hunched spines. These images endure even today, especially around Halloween, the crone as caricature, not character. What we often forget is that most of the accused were healers. They were women who knew how to make salves, ease childbirth, soothe fevers, or make tinctures for grief. They were the caretakers of their communities until fear made their knowledge dangerous, and so the crone became a curse, both in language and in law. She was no longer the grandmother at the fire. She was the figure in the shadows, the one you feared, the one you blamed. But beneath the hysteria, the old magic remained. It was not eradicated, only driven deeper. Women kept whispering to each other. Recipes were memorized instead of written down. Rituals moved indoors. Knowledge passed from hand to hand in secret, like an ember. The crone may have been burned in name, but her wisdom smoldered quietly in the margins. And one day, many years later, it would rise again. As the centuries turned, and the embers of the witch hunts cooled, the crone found a new prison, the pages of fairy tales, and the ink of cautionary fiction. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the violent persecution of women as witches was fading, but its legacy endured in story, and where the pyre stopped, the pen took over. The crone, once hunted, then silenced, was now flattened. She became a symbol, no longer dangerous in real life, but persistently monstrous in imagination. In the tales collected by the Brothers Grimm, we find her again and again. She is the old woman who tricks, imprisons, curses, and lures. She lives in gingerbread houses, spins gold for children she later tries to steal, or appears just long enough to cast a single devastating spell. Think of the wicked stepmother in Snow White, the spindle-wielding enchantress of Sleeping Beauty, or the cannibalistic witch in Hansel and Gretel. She is rarely given a name, rarely a backstory. She exists to test, punish, or destroy. In Victorian literature, too, the aging woman became suspect. Novels often portrayed older unmarried women as bitter, grasping, or reclusive. Miss Havisham, forever trapped in her yellowing wedding dress. The unnamed madwoman in the attic. Even sympathetic characters were tinged with suspicion. Spinsterhood, after all, was still a kind of social failure. These depictions reflected and reinforced cultural anxieties around women who stepped out of traditional roles. A Crone in fiction wasn't just a character. She was a warning. And then came film. In the 20th century, cinema gave visual permanence to the Crone's caricature. In early Disney films especially, the transformation from beautiful young woman to hideous old hag was a recurring motif. Snow White's stepmother physically morphs into a hunched old crone, as though her jealousy and ambition corrupted her very flesh. The moral was simple. To age as a woman is to fall. To desire power is to become monstrous. To live beyond usefulness is to decay into irrelevance or evil. These patterns stuck. Generations of children absorbed them, long before they understood the mechanics of gender or ageism. They knew instinctively that a sharp nose and a walking stick meant danger, that the old woman in the woods could not be trusted. That wisdom came from young princes, not old women. The Crone had gone from goddess to ghost to villain, and yet, not all was lost. Some stories kept her complexity alive. In global folklore, especially outside the Western canon, older women continued to appear as wise teachers, protectors, and mediators. In Japanese tales, there's the Yama-uba, a mountain crone who sometimes eats children and sometimes saves them. In West African storytelling, elderly women are often powerful narrators, the oral keepers of tribal history. In indigenous traditions across the Americas, grandmothers are revered as cultural anchors, truth bearers, and healers. Even within European tradition, shadows of the true crone remain. She's just hidden beneath layers of narrative dust, waiting to be uncovered and reclaimed. But to do that, we first have to understand, why did the idea of the aging woman become so deeply uncomfortable in the modern West? And what exactly have we lost in turning away from her? That is the question we'll begin to unravel next. Some point, society stopped fearing old women because of their power and started fearing them because of their presence. As the industrial age gained momentum and the modern West prioritized productivity, youth, and speed, something ancient was pushed aside: the reverence for slow knowledge, for cyclical wisdom, for time-worn experience. Aging, once a rite of passage, became a kind of failure. And for women especially, it became a sentence. Youth was no longer just a stage of life, it became a currency. And with that shift, the crone, who had always belonged to the second half of life, was exiled yet again, this time under the banner of modern beauty culture. The signs were subtle at first: magazine covers that rarely featured gray hair, anti-aging creams that promised to reverse time, a million-dollar industry built on denial. Women were taught that to be seen, they must be smooth. To be loved, they must be lifted. To be relevant, they must be unwrinkled. It wasn't just about appearance, it was about erasure. To age visibly as a woman became a small rebellion. To let your hair go silver, to stop apologizing for your laugh lines, to take up space even when you were no longer the object of male attention. What was once normal, even sacred, was now subversive. But it's not just about wrinkles and creams. In modern Western societies, older women often find themselves socially invisible. They disappear from film, from media, from leadership. The vast majority of leading roles in Hollywood belong to women under 40. Female news anchors age out of prime time far earlier than their male counterparts. Executives over 50 report being passed over for promotions or viewed as outdated. The message is clear: the older you get, the quieter you should become. This is not a universal human truth, it is a cultural construct, and a recent one at that. In many indigenous communities, elderhood is revered. In Buddhist monasteries, older women often become the most respected teachers. In matrilineal societies, grandmothers hold immense cultural power, making decisions for entire families, guiding rites of passage, preserving history. But in the contemporary West, the value of a woman's voice has often been directly tied to her desirability. Once that metric changes, she is no longer considered an authority, only an afterthought. And this is where the image of the crone quietly returns. Because when society no longer listens to you, no longer looks at you, no longer fears you, that is when your truest power can reemerge. Unwatched, she becomes unbound. Unhindered by expectation, she becomes expansive. And in that quiet space between roles and labels, something ancient stirs. The same knowing that once guided the triple goddess, the same rootedness found in the forest-dwelling wise women, the same clarity that lit torches in Hecate's hands. Because the crone is not just a symbol of aging, she is a symbol of arrival. She is what happens when you are no longer performing. She is what remains when all the masks have been set down, not out of defeat, but out of choice. In the modern world, to identify with the crone is a quiet act of resistance, not bitterness, not retreat, but a refusal to be erased. Reclamation begins quietly, not with fanfare, but with a whisper. A woman in her kitchen saying, "I'm tired of pretending." Another in a bookstore stumbling across the word crone and feeling inexplicably seen. A group of gray-haired women gathering in circles, lighting candles, telling stories not of what they were, but of who they are now becoming. The word crone, so long used to diminish, has begun to shift. Not through media campaigns or corporate rebranding, but through women claiming it for themselves. Not with shame, but with sovereignty. In the last few decades, particularly since the 1970s, feminist scholars and spiritual writers have worked to unearth the dignity of the crone. Writers like Barbara G. Walker, Marion Woodman, and Clarissa Pinkola Estes didn't just explore the archetype, they honored it. They invited women to see aging not as decline, but as deepening. Walker wrote, "The crone is the wise one, the teacher, the healer, the one who has seen death and does not fear it." Estes urged us to reclaim the wild woman within, the one who walks her own path, away from the gaze into the woods of her own knowing. And beyond the written word, grassroots movements have blossomed. Red tents, moon circles, crone councils, and retreats where elderhood is not only respected, but celebrated. There are podcasts now with names like The Crone's Nest and Rewilding for Women. Social media accounts where older women speak with confidence, humor, and insight, sharing herbal remedies, life lessons, menopause journeys, and unapologetic truths. They speak not to please, but to pass on. Not to seek attention, but to create continuity. In many ways, we're witnessing the return of oral tradition, but through digital means. The crone, once silenced, is now broadcast. Quietly, powerfully, she is retelling her story. Importantly, this modern crone is not confined to any one aesthetic. She might be gray-haired, yes, but she might also dye her hair red, wear Doc Martens, hike mountain trails, or garden in silence. She may be childless or a grandmother of 12. She might be spiritual or skeptical, introverted or blunt. What unites modern crones is not their style, it is their stance. They are done seeking permission. They live in a space between no longer and not yet, no longer trying to please, not yet finished with the world. They are the women who write memoirs, who take up sculpture, who move to cabins, who finally say the things they've swallowed for decades. They are not always nice. They are often disruptive, but their disruption is holy. And perhaps most beautifully, they are turning toward each other. One of the tragedies of the past century was the fracturing of generations, the separation of elders from the young, the rise of nuclear families, and the decline of grandmother-centered homes. Many women reached cronehood alone, unsure of what it meant, unsupported in the process. But that too is changing. Younger women now seek out the wisdom of older ones, not just for recipes or parenting tips, but for perspective, for truth-telling, for witnessing, for blessing. The crone is being remembered not just as a phase, but as a role, a verb, something to grow into with intention. And just as maiden and mother were once celebrated with rituals, first blood, first birth, women today are creating rituals for the third transformation, stepping fully into cronehood. There are ceremonies now where women crown themselves with silver, not to signal the end, but the beginning of their time as keepers, visionaries, and elders. And in doing so, they are rewriting the myth. The crone is not the end of the story. She is the woman who finally begins to tell her own. A time of noise, the crone listens. In a time of haste, she waits. And in a time of endless surface, she invites us deeper. Cronehood, as it's being reclaimed, may offer more than personal empowerment. It may be a form of cultural medicine. Because what if what's broken in the modern world isn't just our treatment of older women, but our loss of what they once held? We live in a time marked by disconnection, families scattered, elders isolated, wisdom archived but not lived, generations siloed into age groups, each speaking their own language, rarely in dialogue. And beneath all that, a rising loneliness, the kind that seeps into everything, relationships, attention spans, even the way we touch the earth. What would change if we remembered the role of the crone? Not the cartoon version, not the witch, but the elder who watches from the edge, the woman who knows when to speak and when to simply hold space, the one who remembers the cycles of seasons, of lives, of mistakes we keep repeating. She is not impressed by our metrics of success. She is not seduced by speed or flash. She knows how to wait for the storm to pass or to sit with you through it. And that energy, that ancient calm, that clarity is desperately missing from public life. Where are the elders in our governments, our newsrooms, our tech companies? In a world where youth is idolized and speed is currency, the crone reminds us of something quieter and deeper: discernment, perspective, slowness. In many indigenous traditions, elders speak last. Everyone else gives their opinion, and only then do the wisdom keepers offer theirs. Why? Because their voice carries weight. They've seen things before. They've lived through cycles. They understand not just what, but when. Imagine if we brought that rhythm back. Imagine if every community had a circle of crones, not advisory boards or think tanks, but witnesses. Women who had permission not to solve, but to see. Not to direct, but to hold the larger picture. In a society addicted to doing, the crone offers being. In a culture drowning in more, she teaches enough. This isn't to say crones are perfect or passive. Many are still fierce, still full of fire, but that fire is tempered, honed, not reactive but rooted. In some cultures, older women are entrusted with telling the stories of the people, not just legends and myths, but who we are and how we became this way. That too is medicine, because in the telling of history, especially herstory, there is a salve, a rebalancing. Younger women learn that they are not alone. Middle-aged women realize they are not over, and older women remember they are still becoming. The presence of the crone restores something lost, continuity. She's the thread that ties generations, the memory that lives in more than books, the calm voice that says, "This has happened before, and we are still here." So when we reclaim the crone, we don't just uplift aging women, we heal a cultural fracture. We say to the world, wisdom lives here, even now, especially now. XXLS2. Not all crones have gray hair. Not all of them are old. Sometimes crone energy arrives in a quiet moment, when something shifts inside you and you suddenly see the world differently. Not with urgency, but with understanding. Not with fear, but with a quiet kind of knowing. We often imagine the crone as an elder, a wise woman with lined hands and patient eyes. And yes, she lives there, but she can also be found in the silence that follows loss, or the stillness after a long chapter ends, or the moment someone stops trying to prove anything at all. The crone isn't always a person. Sometimes she's a feeling, the part of us that listens instead of speaks, the part that values depth over speed, the part that stops reaching and simply rests. You don't have to earn her. You don't have to chase her. She arrives when you're ready to welcome her, sometimes early, sometimes much later, but always gently. In some people, she appears after a heartbreak. In others, after a birth or an illness or simply a long, slow becoming. She doesn't announce herself. She just arrives, quietly, softly, without needing to be seen. Even if you're young, you might have felt her already. In the way you care for others without needing credit. In the way you sense what isn't being said. In the way you've begun to value peace over praise. Cronehood isn't a title. It's a rhythm, and you'll know when it finds you. There's nothing to prepare for, no list to complete, no version of yourself you need to become. Just a little more stillness, a little more space, a little more time to hear what your own heart is whispering. She isn't here to lead a revolution. She's here to keep you company, to remind you that this moment, just as it is, holds everything you need. So if you're listening tonight and the day has left you weary, let this chapter simply be a place to rest. No demands, no striving, no expectations, just the slow, steady return of your breath. There is something about the earth that understands the crone, not the busy city street or the glowing screen, but the soft forest floor, the wind in dry grass, the ancient hush of stone. The crone belongs there. She always has. She knows the rhythm of things that take time to grow and longer still to break down. She is not hurried. She does not bloom out of season. She moves like the moon, waning, then waxing, then waning again. And so does the earth. And it's no coincidence that crone archetypes across cultures are often tied to soil, seasons, harvest, and decay. In Greek mythology, Hecate walks the crossroads with dogs at her side, lantern in hand. In Celtic tradition, the Kylie is the veiled one, a weather goddess who shapes the land and sleeps through spring. In Slavic lore, Baba Yaga's hut sits on chicken legs deep in the woods, surrounded by bones. These aren't just characters. They are expressions of the land itself, fierce, maternal, unpredictable, and wise. They teach us that not everything is meant to be beautiful in a youthful way. Some things are beautiful because they endure, because they hold memory, because they return, season after season, without needing to be asked. The modern world often forgets this. We are taught to prune ourselves constantly, to stay fresh, to stay new, to avoid aging like it's some mistake. But the land knows better. Trees don't apologize when their leaves fall. The moon doesn't rush to be full again. Winter doesn't try to look like spring. And the crone doesn't have to explain herself. She walks through the woods with a slower step now, but each footfall carries stories. Her fingers may tremble, but they know the names of plants, the way rain smells before it comes, and how to sit in silence with something that's dying. She doesn't need to conquer nature. She is nature. And in this way, she becomes a kind of teacher, not of facts or techniques, but of presence. She reminds us that endings are not mistakes, that stillness is not failure, that decay is part of the cycle, not the end of it. In a time when we are disconnected from the land, from our food, from our bodies, the crone calls us back, not with force, but with gravity. She draws us toward grounding, not to tame us, but to root us, to put bare feet on soil, to listen for the turning of the year, to remember that wisdom doesn't arrive in a scroll or a tweet, but often in a garden bed, a compost pile, or a long walk with no destination. She is the whisper in your bones when you're tired of pretending, the exhale you didn't know you needed, the part of you that knows, deep down, that your value has nothing to do with output. She is in every way earthbound and proud of it. Before LS1, there were books. Before ink and parchment, before the printing press or pixel, there were women who remembered. They sat by firesides, weaving threads of memory and myth into the air. They spoke of births and burials, of long winters and short summers, of gods who walked among men, and of the grandmothers who remembered them. These were the keepers, the living libraries. They didn't need shelves, they didn't need schools. They had voices and presence and time. In nearly every traditional society, the task of holding the story, the full story, eventually fell to those who had lived long enough to see its patterns. And most often, that meant women, older women, women who had watched whole generations grow, falter, rise again. To be a crone was not just to age, it was to become a vessel of lineage, of memory, of collective truth. Even now, you might feel it, that unspoken trust given to a grandmother's tale, the way a room quiets when an elder begins to speak, the subtle gravity of a voice that knows. This is not accidental, it is ancient. For centuries, the oral tradition was the backbone of every culture. Storytelling wasn't a hobby, it was survival. Through story, we passed on knowledge, how to birth safely, what plants to eat and which ones to fear, what dangers lived in the woods, what kind of love was worth keeping, how to mourn and how to come back from it. And often, it was the older women, the ones past childbearing, past the center of the village drama, who held this wisdom most clearly, not because they were sidelined, but because they were anchored, less pulled by the tides of ego and romance, more rooted in observation, nuance, and history. They had seen the same mistakes before. They had watched time cycle and circle. They knew that some truths didn't need to be proven, only preserved. Even the fairy tales we know today, Cinderella, Snow White, Little Red Riding Hood, were shaped by centuries of oral tellings, many likely passed on by elder women. These stories were not just entertainment, they were encoded lessons, warnings, mirrors. And while many of these tales were later softened, sanitized, or rebranded by male writers, their origin remains feminine. Folk knowledge, hearth wisdom, crone voice. Today, we live in an age of endless noise, short-form content, scrolls and skims and sound bites. But the hunger for story hasn't left us. In fact, it may be deeper than ever. We don't just want facts. We want meaning. We don't just want to know what happened. We want to feel what it meant and how it shaped us. And that is the Crone's domain. She is the one who sees not just the moment, but the arc. Not just the hero, but the lesson. Not just the end, but the echo. So when you hear a long, slow story, the kind told in a soothing voice, the kind that takes its time, you are not simply being entertained. You are being gathered, drawn into an ancient rhythm, a remembering. That's why you're here. That's why this matters. Because in reclaiming the crone, we reclaim the story. And in reclaiming the story, we begin to heal what we've forgotten. The L2 crone has never truly disappeared. She has been buried beneath centuries of misunderstanding, misnamed, miscast, misjudged, but not forgotten. She has waited, patient as old stone, silent as moonlight, soft as moss on ancient bark. She has walked beside us even when we didn't know her name, and now slowly she returns, not to reclaim power in the way empires do, but to remind us of what power once meant and still can. The crone does not shout, she hums. She does not demand, she invites. She does not perform, she simply is. In her, we find something the world is starving for, a version of wisdom that is quiet, embodied, and enough. She is the woman who no longer competes, the woman who no longer apologizes, the woman who tells stories because she must, because silence would be betrayal. And she is also the part of you that longs for stillness, the part that is ready to stop striving, the part that wants truth more than titles, rest more than recognition, wholeness more than hurry. Reclaiming the crone is not just an intellectual exercise, it's an act of remembering and allowing. Letting go of youth as the only measure of beauty. Letting go of productivity as the only measure of worth. Letting go of visibility as the only sign of presence. You don't have to look a certain way. You don't need gray hair or grandchildren. You only need space and the willingness to step into it. So tonight, let this story settle around you. Let the words soften your edges. Let the breath come slower. Let the silence after the sentence be part of the telling. And know that the crone walks beside you, now and always. She is not a ghost of who you were. She is the future whispering back to you. Welcome her. Listen. Rest. Join me tomorrow night for more of women's history.